Good afternoon. Okay. No, it's fine. It's fine. Non, mieux peut-être pas là, comme ça je regarde directement le... She is a speaker, and she's going to be the second speaker actually. Hello. If you want to sit there, it's probably easier than to change, whatever, and Martin will provide you with the micro. She's the other speaker. She's the other speaker. We have reserved some places there, so it's easier to jump in, but if you prefer to stay there, it's... Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our Prio seminar. Thank you very much for staying with us for this afternoon. We are now going to have a panel that is focusing more on the EU and in particular on the EU response. So we're slightly shifting the perspective. We're going to have 5 important and to the point experts presenting their different point of view actually on the situation and the current response at the European level. First of all, let me thank you, Maria and Prio, for organizing this event, and also the Minister of Foreign Affairs to make it possible to invite us to organize it. Maria is going also to present at the end of this presentation, and you will hear more about a different take probably on the situation, more from a security perspective or critical security perspective. But let's start with Line Olestad. From the Contingency Planning Secretariat of the Norwegian Ship Owners Association.
Yes.
Please.
Yeah. So as you introduced me, I'm from the Norwegian Ship Owners Association. So we have a bit of a different perspective from what we've heard this morning about this crisis, because our vessels are actually, I just want to start with this, all over the world. We have the Norwegian controlled fleet, which is both Norwegian flagged and other flagged vessels. We have about 8,800 ships. They're everywhere, and they meet every sort of security difficulty in the world. This is from the Mediterranean, which we can see here. There are ships in all the different flows of migration, both the Western, Central, and Eastern Mediterranean. So our ships rescued about 5,000 people last year, and I will start with showing a small video clip, a bit about how sort of their experience was doing this.
Ja, det er helt jo. Der stender 2 kanner med 15 liter på framme her.
Vi kan jo komme med noe. Ja, vi må nå bare hente da.
Ja,
Hvis det begynner å sette ut, for det er når det er første vei drag.
ja, hvis noen begynner å bære da.
Jeg kan godt begynne å bære. Everybody will be relaxed. We will save everybody. Skal vi begynne? Alle klare?
You have to fasten the rope in the boat. You have to wait. You have to wait. Ja, det er nok. Begynner ikke du å bli jævlig sliten nå? Sikker på det? Vi får ha stått der siden vi begynte.
You're welcome. I'll let them keep calm.
Yeah.
Get us one by one here.
Yes.
Okay? That's okay. It's nice. Keep the hallet på hus.
Oh.
Her er vi i Riskoppen barnehage. Onkel Stig.
We have this hose where you can walk.
So this is from the Italian Coast Guard, which is about that they rescued last year in 2014. And out of those, 42,000 were rescued by merchant vessels. And I just want to point out this was when Mare Nostrum operation was still much there. So merchant vessels have been rescuing people even when the Italians were very forward. We now know that Mare Nostrum has been taken down and Triton came in replacements. Out of these, about 98% were rescued at sea. Most of the boats never actually make it through to the Italian shores, which shows the need for search and rescue capacity actually at sea. This also shows this is the area which is the Triton area. I know now there's discussions in the EU that this area is going to be enlarged. This is where most of them actually get rescued. So it's outside of the Triton operation. Therefore, the Norwegian Shipowners Association has been very forward about the fact that we need rescue operations where the migrants are being rescued. And as we saw from the map, where the merchant vessels are, we are everywhere. And if there's no other search and rescue capacity, we have a moral and a legal obligation to pick up those people. When we pick them up, the next step is that we need to disembark them. We also need enough capacity, which we did during Mare Nostrum, for them to actually come to the merchant vessels and take the refugees from our merchant vessel over to the Italian or other search and rescue of Frontex capacity, and then take them to shore in order to avoid that our vessels actually have to go to Italy, which there has been a tendency towards this year because there just hasn't been enough capacity. This is the countries, the different merchant fleet that have picked up refugees this year. So this is from 1st of January to 22nd of April. Already we rescued 7,700 in 210 different operations. This number I think is even higher now. And I also want to point out this is the Italian Coast Guard. These pictures are from a rescue operation from a Norwegian fleet vessel last week. This is off Spain, between Morocco and Spain. This is the Spanish Coast Guard. So what they did here is that they saw the boat. They weren't called up. They saw the boat. They tied the boat to the ship. and gave them water and food, and then called up the Spanish Coast Guard, which came and picked them up after about 2 hours. Oh, sorry, let me go back. This is just a picture of the different types of ships that we have in our fleet. And as you may see, some of them can be used for search and rescue, but others, such as this is an LNG ship, this is a car ship, this is a chemical tanker, they're not made for this. It's actually quite dangerous. They have to take the refugees from the little migrant boats on board these ships is very difficult. They have a huge, high freeboard. They have dangerous cargo. So it's not a sustainable situation that the merchant fleet do these operations. And this is a very also, all these pictures are taken from Norwegian ships. This is when they have come too late and they haven't been able to rescue them. And this is a big challenge for the crew to actually meet these, see this, come into a sort of a sea of corpses. And they're not trained for this. They're 18-year-old boys or 28-year-old men who are there to work at oil platform rigs or deliver goods. They're not ready to start picking up corpses. From another point, there's other security challenges. We don't know who these refugees or migrants are. We don't know if there's human smugglers that are among them. For instance, this picture over here is taken from a Norwegian ship. Afterwards, they found out that he has been arrested by the Italian police. He was on board. They don't know if terrorists may use this. I know the NATO General Secretary, Jens Stoltenberg, said that ISIS may use this transport as a way to get into Europe. Once again, they're not armed. They have no way to fight back. They generally are a crew of about 15 people, and the maximum they've had on board is almost 500. So a crew of 15 against 500, if they try and take over the ship, they have no way to sort of fight back. What we've been talking about this morning, human smugglers. Once again, these are pictures taken from a boat, a Norwegian boat. They come, they take back the refugee boat, and they tow it back to Libya. We've also had reports that these little mother sort of vessels here wait around, sometimes maybe even armed, they don't know. They get told by the Italian Coast Guard to destroy these little ships, which is what they now want to do. So here they're burning one, but when you have a vessel here, you don't dare really to do it because you don't know what's going to happen. And so this is something, it's just not a sustainable situation that the merchant fleet is the one that is dealing with this. And that's something we have spoken about quite a lot. So in some sort of conclusion, I think once again, we spoke about it this morning about pull factor and search and rescue resources. One thing is pull factor. What we've heard during the winter months of 2014, 2015 is that it was worse on a winter day than a summer day of 2014. The numbers have gone up after Mare Nostrum was pulled down. So that's one observation that we have made. Also, our ships are there. Not only our ships, but other commercial vessels are in the area. So if you don't have enough search and rescue resources, you still have the merchant fleet, which has an obligation to pick them up. And as I've said, they're not prepared for it, crew-wise or the different ship types. So it's a dangerous situation both for the migrants and a dangerous situation for the crew. We have a responsibility to assist those in need. We have a SOLAS system and rules that do, and we continue to follow that. We will always follow that, but the SOLAS and this system is not made for this large-scale migration flows that we're seeing in Europe right now. It's made for people that are stranded in need or another ship that is sinking and you assist them. It's not made for this type of situation. And there's a limit to how many operations we can take part in. Some of these vessels are operating for a rig as a security system for around an oil platform. They can't just leave because then the platform is in difficulty. So we've spoken about the fact that we do need adequate official search and rescue resources in the places where the densest migratory routes are. And I think that is sort of our very clear message, is that merchant vessels can't be the ones to do this by themselves. So that was it. Yeah. Better.
Your policy liaison officer, IOM regional office for the European Economic Area and the NATO.
Where do I find the presentation? Sorry. In any case, I would like to thank Prio for inviting us to speak here, and I'll welcome you all. I can...
Which one is it?
Oh, okay, sorry. It's this one, IOM.
This one?
Yes, exactly. Right. I'll just give a small word of introduction about our organization. We're the International Organization for Migration, and we are a global intergovernmental organization with 157 member states at present and 10 observers. We have more than 460 country offices all over the world, 9,000 staff, which are mostly based in field locations, and we're the world's leading organization dealing with migration. So our mandate includes upholding human dignity and well-being of migrants, but also assist in meeting the growing operational challenges of migration management, which we have been discussing a lot today. Also advance the understanding of migration issues and encourage social and economic development through migration. And I think that's a point that we haven't reached yet in our discussions today, and which I will discuss a little bit further. First of all, I would like to give a bit of a reflection on the title of today's event. We were talking about a humanitarian crisis on the doorstep of Europe, and speakers in the previous panel have also already given their ideas about this. But should we be speaking of a crisis? Europe seems to have forgotten that 70 years ago, it were Europeans that were uprooted by war and poverty, and that were fleeing. And that's where the UN Convention was created, and that's where UNHCR was created, as well as IOM, to deal with that refugee crisis at the time. And then in the blink of an eye, Europe went from this immigration continent to a destination continent. And our welcome actually leaves much to be desired. We have sort of drawn up the bridge, and we've entered this crisis mode as if Europe is under siege by migrants. But is this the case? And let's put this a bit in perspective. The European Union is a political and economic continent of 500 million people with vast resources. If we look at Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, they're much smaller, they have much less resources, and they're dealing with millions of displaced people. We see 4 million people displaced by the Syrian crisis and being in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Lebanon is dealing with 1.2 million refugees. That's over a quarter of their own population. These are huge numbers. They can say that they're under siege. We've seen that over the course of 2 days in 2014, in September 2014, 100,000 Kurdish refugees fled, as you remember, the IS violence in the north of Syria. And they've entered Turkey, and Turkey has accommodated them and helped them and received them. And that was a huge number over a very small period of time. But we see more recent numbers. I mean, just looking at the electoral violence that was there now in Burundi over the last 3 weeks, 70,000 Burundians have left Burundi and crossed over in Tanzania. These are huge numbers, and yet we seem to think that we are under siege. And no doubt that we don't want to deny the fact that some of the southern member states are under huge pressure. But according to Italy's own Ministry of Interior numbers, the number of people that have arrived, and these numbers are shown here, 34,570 by our data until the 7th of May, is approximately the same as last year's 2014 data. What do we see, however, in Greece is that the number is 27,800 people already arrived in this first quarter, or let's say until the 7th of May. And this is 2/3 of the entire number that arrived over the whole of 2014. Greece is experiencing a huge up in the numbers of people arriving, and we have been talking mostly about the central Mediterranean route. So I just wanted to put that a little bit in perspective. What is striking, though, is the number of people who have died at sea, and we have already been speaking about that as well. We're up to 2,300 migrants deaths worldwide, and we see that the deadliest route is in the Mediterranean with 1,829 deaths, according to our Missing Migrants project. And this is an emergency. This is too much. These numbers are too high, and it's an emergency in terms of human cost, and it requires an appropriate response from our side. But whereas we do face this crisis generated by the huge number of migrant deaths, we cannot state that the number of arrivals is a huge migration challenge. What is a challenge is the crisis, or what we're facing in Europe is a crisis of memory and of perspective, and of balance and of political will. And a crisis footing is actually not very conducive to the way we are reacting, because it makes us react in these very defensive, quick fix ways, as have been explained by some of the panelists this morning. And what we would like to see is a politically more courageous vision that looks at longer term and more structural ways of addressing this, this issue. Issue, I should say, of addressing migration, because we don't want to see it as an issue as such. Because what IOM believes truly is that it's very important to recognize that large-scale migration will be inevitable, and actually it will be necessary and will be desirable. And this it can work if it is well governed, and this should be done through the adoption of and implementation of sensible and responsible policies. And we also need to refocus our cooperation with third countries in that mentality. We need to see the challenges and the responsibilities that we are facing are also their challenges and their responsibilities. We need to cooperate and work together with them. The drivers have been mentioned this morning. The tragedy in the Mediterranean is a result of social, economic, and demographic inequalities, instability and conflict. There is no denying that, but also environmental degradation, which is exacerbated by climate change. We have rights abuses, we have weak governments, we have failed states. We've named them all. And the reality show that this is very much a mixed migration crisis, or a mixed migration movement. We see mostly men moving, but we also see an increase in women and unaccompanied minors, which still shows that there are protection needs there as well. And while we see that some people move out of West Africa looking for economic prosperity, there are also those who move, Nigerians. Do they move because of protection concerns, or are they moving because of economic prosperity regions? This is very difficult to make the distinction there. We were talking this morning, we're talking refugees or fortune seekers, but Nigerians can be affected by the Boko Haram violence. Christian Nigerians might be actually fleeing persecution and violence. So it's important that this the asylum system that we have looks at who do we need to protect and who can we protect, and what are the solutions for others that we can't protect. Therefore, IOM has put together some key messages and is advocating for some key messages in dealing with the situation in the Mediterranean. And these 4 key messages should guide our responses. And what is very essential is that they are used simultaneously and with equal resolve. And that is something that I really want to strongly underline. The first one is saving lives and protecting rights. We are of the position that there is a pressing need to address the human rights and protection needs of migrants, and I say migrants on purpose, in complementary with the existing asylum tools. A holistic migration management framework in the EU would allow to alleviate strains on the EU's asylum system. And it would give the capacities to the EU and the member states to respond not only to the short-term, but also to the long-term needs of affected population. It would allow us to respond to the large numbers of migrants which are not covered by the protection tools that we have, and that fall in irregular or vulnerable categories, because we cannot deny that those are mixed in those flows as well. So what are IOM's ongoing and planned activities? I just want to point to a few of them because it would be too long to describe all of them. We advocate for sufficient resources for search and rescue, as it cannot be picked up by merchant vessels. They're not equipped, and there just needs to be an efficient response from the EU member states and the EU at EU level in search and rescue. And then we assist states like Italy and Greece to put in place a humane and a dignified reception system, and to see that referral services are available, that there is effective access to health and psychosocial services, and that there are options for those who arrive, such as assisted voluntary return and reintegration. And I stress here also the reintegration component. Those who voluntarily want to return because they cannot access the protection system in Europe and they are not allowed to stay, and they want to voluntarily return to their country of origin, need to be supported. We cannot just have them go back without any means, because they have invested in their trip to Europe, and they will be poorer off if we just send them back without any reintegration assistance. We're also setting migration resource and response mechanisms en route, because the issue is not just the Mediterranean and the countries which are the gates to Europe. It's en route, as we were discussing in Niger. They're facing very perilous journeys through the Saharan desert. We want to set up response mechanism where we do information and awareness raising towards these migrants, where we tell them what the risks are. Nevertheless, they might still want to face these risks, but they need to be told, they need to be, there are pictures on Facebook of smugglers and facilitators with huge cruise ships that are saying, this is the way you will go to Europe. And this we have to counteract. We have to put in place real information towards the migrants. A second part is addressing the drivers of irregular migration. It's very important that we reduce the negative factors that induce irregular migration, and that we enable a true choice between migrating and not migrating. And this means that we mainstream migration into development plans, national development plans, and poverty reduction strategies, that we address both the root causes of migration as well as reintegration measures for those returning migrants. Initiatives need to look at improving economic opportunities, social services in countries of origin, community infrastructure. We need to ensure that there is, or we need to promote stability and development in countries of origin. If people don't have opportunities to have their children be educated, if they don't have jobs, if they don't have livelihood opportunities, they will feel that the only solution to their current situation is migration. And it shouldn't be the only solution. It should be one of the solutions, and they should have the ability to make that choice. IOM's ongoing and planned activities in this area are, of course, we're advocating for countering the smuggling of migrants, and we're working hard on counter-smuggling, counter-trafficking with countries, with border agencies, to make them aware of what is going on. But what is very important in addressing the root causes is that we also work very hard and in cooperation and in dialogue with third countries, that we promote governance and community engagement, and that there is community infrastructure, that there are ways of providing social inclusion and equity, social services in third countries, so that people have other opportunities. Promoting safe, orderly and dignified human mobility, it's very important that the European Union realizes that by the year 2050, we will require tens of millions of labor migrants. And we have to get to the point where we are prepared to rethink our whole approach towards how we manage our labor market programs and how migration could contribute to that. See migration in a positive light. And this will require some serious work in the European member states, because we need to work in another way with third countries, countries of origin, countries of transit. We need to ensure that we have an approach which is one of not just we want to keep people out. We are putting up our defenses, and we are putting up our border management infrastructure, and we're asking you to deal with our problem. But we are prepared to help you deal with the problem. We are prepared to help you develop your country, to put in place temporary and circular migration possibilities. So it's increasing and simplifying regular migration channels. I mentioned temporary and seasonal labor migration, but also circular migration. And of course, because we're dealing in 2015, if we look at the main countries of origin, we see Syrians in there, Eritreans, Somalians. It's not easy to say, okay, we will help you develop your countries. That's not going to be an immediate solution. For them, we will have to have humanitarian admission programs. We have a temporary protection directive in Europe, but we have never activated it. Temporary protection would mean, because that's also what Syrians tell us time and time again in the region where they have fled to, we don't want to per se stay in Europe. We don't even want to go to Europe, but we cannot stay here because in Lebanon we are facing, the host communities don't want us here anymore. We're coming to a breaking point. We want to go back. So it's important that this temporary is not just perceived as something negative, but can be something that works. And we need to promote, of course, positive use of migration. We had a migration migrants contribute campaign. We have a social media campaign whereby migrants are depicted as heroes. They do a lot for the development of our countries, and we should start to see those positive effects. And what is very important as well is that we integrate migration into the trade and the economic growth strategy that Europe should be thinking about. And then our last point is developing partnerships for growth. I already said it a little bit. Structural conditions and systemic changes that enable the positive outcomes of migration. That's what we should work for and work towards. And this will mean a lot of public-private dialogue on migration policies and opportunities, interministerial coordination, because it's not just the development actors, or it's not just the humanitarian aid department that should pick up the bill or should deal with these issues, and work with the diaspora. And one of our overarching messages, let's put it like that, is that we should shift the rhetoric and change the narrative of migration. And we try to do this through several public campaigns, through social media campaigns. To come to the European agenda on migration. This was launched 13th of May last week. It's very recent. It has a number of immediate responses, and it has the way forward and 4 action domains. Of course, as IOM, we have welcomed the EU agenda on migration. It's a good initial step, and there the focus should be, or my focus is on the initial step. It's a first step, because it would need to give a bit more attention to a migration governance view. What we find is that the EU's policy proposal is predominantly oriented towards asylum seekers, and it should have a better focus, or it is a little focused on migrants. We are, of course, welcoming the Commission's renewed focus on life-saving. It's important, and we are ready to support that with concrete measures. But we want to move beyond this crisis response towards medium and longer-term reforms. And so where we welcome the agenda, we also have a few points which are not necessarily criticisms, but where it could work or where it should become better. So because of what was happening in the Mediterranean, they have focused their immediate response on immediate concrete actions, which are mostly linked to the situation that they are facing in the Mediterranean. And that has, of course, followed it has the EU Council statement of the 23rd of April, and the European Parliament's resolution has come out on that, and that is reflected here in the red part. It's tripling the budget for Triton's operation and Poseidon, but as was already mentioned in the previous presentation, it's not just tripling the budget, they need to extend their operational area. So that's what we have been advocating for with IOM, extend your operational area. with targeting criminals, smuggling networks, and they were also going to destroy the vessels. Yes, but be very careful about that, because destroying the vessels, you might just destroy by accident fishermen vessels. Yeah, the migrants might be caught in between. So you have to be very very thoughtful when you present such solutions. A temporary relocation scheme, yes and no. There is a lot of resistance from the EU member states themselves. There was no mention of family unit taking into account the voluntariness on the part of the people that would be relocated. So there are still a lot of gaps and still of unknowns, a lot of unknowns. There is the EU-wide resettlement scheme of 20,000 places. Again, a very good first and initial step, but this needs to be upscaled because it's peanuts compared to what others are doing. And it also needs to become mandatory, because leaving it voluntary, it will not work. Just to move on because of the time, then they have identified the 4 levels of action, which would be then the more longer term migration policy. And this migration policy would then respect the rights to seek asylum, respond to the humanitarian challenge, provide a clear European framework for common migration policy, and stand the test of time, or this is according to the European Commission. And while we welcome the 4 key action points, reducing the incentives for irregular migration, you saw that back in my key messages, saving lives and securing external borders, strong asylum policy, and a new policy on legal migration, we find that most of it is, and we have already been discussing that, oriented towards a border management, a security perspective, and not enough is done on this new policy on legal migration in particular. So it's as if the European approach tends to see migration still as a problem that is shipped from third countries and is deposited on the shores of Europe. While overall we find that they miss the opportunity to advance EU policies on migration and to come up with a common European migration policy. It's still too much focused on what are we going to do in the common European asylum policy, which they have been working on for the last 7 years. The directives are there. Now it's time to put them in place and to come up with penalties, to come up with a more mandatory framework as to everyone has to implement it. Because as well, if we look at reducing the incentives for irregular migration, and if you look into the particular points that they mentioned there, it is very much a defensive standpoint, and it's very much Frontex will up its role in return operations, and then we speak about forced return, while there is the return directive that has always focused on voluntary return as the primary objective. These are things that we would have liked to see a little bit more of, a little bit more migration focused, and a little bit more a vision for the future. That also takes into account this need for labor migration, that sort of helps the EU put through its strategy of growth and prosperity, and actually brings in the rest of the world or the migrants as something that can contribute to that policy.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I'm sure that we will come back again. To the EU migration plan, and I'll give the floor to Paul Nesse, Senior Advisor of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you to Prio for organizing this event. Thank you to the Ministry for picking up the tab, and to all of you for coming. I'm very happy and honored to be asked to speak. The Mediterranean issue now is the largest protection crisis Europe has faced in 20 years. Unfortunately, it took very many dead bodies floating in the Mediterranean for politicians to wake up to reality that they had been told was happening for a long time by people such as the Norwegian Shipowners Association. What we have seen in Europe is a center stage of politics where the politicians have abdicated from their responsibility to act facing such an issue. Maybe the fear for the all those critical of migration, refugees, the fear for those political movements drove everybody else away from this center stage where they have to re-enter. We're seeing a bit of it now, but what we have seen so far is extremely little in compared to the issue we are facing. So I hope both Norwegian politicians and European politicians will take the issue much more seriously and with a completely different sense of ambition than what we've seen so far. The points that you made from IOM are so relevant, very, very good, but they also contain that lack of ambition that we expect to see from somebody governing 500 million people with a lot of economic resources. And the issue we're facing is not all that big. We are talking about less people. Even if there was 1 million, it is less people than Turkey have received last year. It is not all that many. It is less people than any other region in the world is facing refugee-wise at the moment. So Europe is in quite a luxurious position in that they have a manageable task, unless we define it as unmanageable, unless as we define it as a threat that we struggle to overcome. So, that said, we actually have an historical lesson learned, and that's what I would like to talk about. We have faced similar crises before. One of them was in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. After the Vietnam War, we had enormous displacement, refugees leaving by the tens of thousands. Gradually, the conflict ended, but migration and a mixed flow combined with those that fled from persecution. And the international community sat down and adopted a comprehensive plan of action. This is what we should do in Europe again. We have a model. The comprehensive plan of action, just as we have now, it had 4 major geographical areas. The country of origin, where did people leave? Here we're talking many countries, but still the same concept. We have the countries of transit, where such as in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian nations that had refugee camps, temporary settlements, or stopping places for people as they try to move on. We now have the Mediterranean, which we've talked a lot about today, as a particular issue. I'll say no more than just repeat the search and rescue need. Also for the Norwegian ship that we are sending, that the primary responsibility is to save people from drowning. The primary responsibility is not to police. And then we have, for Europe's sake now, the receiving end. We're a continent, we're talking about, we call it burden sharing, let's call it responsibility sharing. The fact that we have started on some plans to look at this in a more comprehensive way. Italy looks the other way as people disembark, and it's very understandable. It's not often in European politics that we say look to Italy, but when it comes to the Mediterranean, they really turned around 180 degrees after the October 2013 Lampedusa tragedy. They mobilized the Mare Nostrum, they mobilized the local municipalities all along the coast, but particularly in the south, on Sicily. And they mobilized a political, the public, official resources in a complete turnaround of approach. They saved, as we've learned, so many people, and then they said to the rest of Europe, hey, this is becoming a bit too much. We need some assistance. And what did they get? Silence from everybody, except one, who said if we save people, it will become a pull factor, as we heard from the British Prime Minister. But things are changing now. Again, back to our model, where we actually approached all these 4 geographical tracks in Southeast Asia. Then we have 4 thematic tracks, if we can call it that. I'll start with the hope track. This is Miriam. Lebanon lost everything, as so many Syrian refugees have. This is Norwegian assistance to the Syrian crisis per person over the last 2 years. People in need are increasing dramatically year by year. Assistance available is decreasing from Norway, from the rest of the countries in Europe. We shall not be able to stop all the Syrians that are now crossing the Mediterranean. That's not our purpose, but we're not doing much to give them other options either. So our assistance to the country of transit is very, very limited as compared to the need. Our present government here says that we are now raising $1 billion for the Syria and the surroundings. That's an increase in total of 6.8% since last year. It is not up to speed, as I said. We have the refugee protection track. At the core of the comprehensive plan of action, the need to preserve the asylum institute, as we talked about, the asylum space, the whole very basic human right of having the possibility to leave your country to seek protection somewhere else. It has to be maintained, and it is, again, not all that big. It was at the core of the comprehensive plan of action. But it was made possible by a parallel migration track, very much governed by IOM. 1 million people were given the alternative of leaving under what was called the orderly departure program, where you were taken from Vietnam, most of them to America, to the US, but there was a comprehensive track for migration alongside the refugee protection track. And you would take it in safety. You didn't need to go on a boat out in the Southeast Asian seas to be part of that program. Then there was another track, which you touched on most of this already, admittedly, but the safe return track. Those that are not in need of protection and those that will not be covered by a migration track has a good, well-organized alternative to having to go back home. And as you mentioned so correctly, with a bit of resources, so you haven't completely lost out. And as we, for instance, did when we worked in Vietnam, with the individual that went back, followed also some development aid, some humanitarian support for the community. So taking back somebody who were not given protection, who were not given a migration permit, you actually got some money to the community. So you were a bit of a winner in the community when you went home. Very essential element of a reasonable approach to sending people home. Then I think very much what we talked about now, the four elements again. The most important element, which we still just on the margins of, I think, in Europe at the moment, is political acknowledgement. We don't need to be scared. We can acknowledge it's a big issue because it's not bigger than we can overcome. And if we throw in a second element of political will and ambition and leadership, this can very well be organized. Again, we're 500 million people. We're the richest continent on Earth. We have a fairly small flow as compared to others. With leadership, we can handle all these tracks, all these themes, if we really want to. And let's, just as we've seen maybe in this country, that coming back to the center stage is more about a public and a political recognition of the problem, and hopefully some more initiatives to address it. The third element, which we also had in the CPA, was coordination, that the different actors came together And they were not so afraid of mandate creep. We didn't have the old debate about IOM's cup of tea and UNHCR's cup of tea and my country and your country. It was quite pragmatic in that we're good at this, you're good at that, we can handle this, you can handle that. But the idea that you made a comprehensive package and those that had capacity fill the loopholes or the missing parts. This is again where Europe has to gain ambition, but it's not all that hard. We've heard how complex it is, but I mean, the world has become complex. We can't give up for that reason. We just have to be a bit more comprehensive about how we approach it. The last aspect of the four is the money trap. It's really not very impressive what the EU has put on the table to handle the issue. 30 million for migration, 20 million euros for resettlement. It's tiny. We need a lot more money. And that is also something that we have, particularly if we take into consideration what you say, the need that we have for more migrants, for a larger workforce. A lot of this is simply good investment. Not to speak about the future of the people whom we want to give a better perception of what their opportunities are. We've talked about radicalization, about the fear. If we don't approach this in a comprehensive way, we're going to have a lot more disillusioned young people at our shores. So it's quite a good investment, actually. If I was in charge of defense budget, I would, you know, take half and put it into this. But all I'm trying to say is we've done it before. It was a success. The comprehensive plan of action actually resulted in the last refugee getting protection, the last migrant going to somewhere else or back home. And it is possible to read about it. Google CPA, and you'll find some very interesting lessons learned to pass on to your political friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I really like the idea of the half budget of defense going there. But we'll come back to that too. I would like to invite Vigdis Vevstad. That's the most difficult Norwegian name so far in the panel, so I'm sorry. Asylum and human rights advisor, you already listened to her in the previous panel. And I hope she will provide us with further legal and lawyer point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this seminar and for inviting me. And if I may start by asking Paul to go directly to Brussels and discuss with the people there about the comprehensive plan, I think that would be a good idea. Now, like Cindy in the former group, my main focus will be in regard to refugees. But I will place my comments in a broader context where there are also other migrants. And I'd like to start by quoting the beginning of the report from the Council of Europe, the Commissioner for Human Rights, this year when he speaks about 2014. He says, 2014 was a bad year for human rights in Europe. Thousands of people died who should not have died, primarily in the Mediterranean Sea and in eastern Ukraine. They should not have died in a Europe that prides itself on being a space where the rule of law and democracy prevails. They should not have died on the doorstep to some of the wealthiest societies on the planet. I'd like to bring this as a backdrop to what I'm going to say now. And I'd also like to remind you that when I speak of Europe, I certainly include Norway in Europe, unless I say otherwise. So Europe is also Norway, of course, in the EU context, in the regional context, through all our cooperation agreements, the Schengen Cooperation Agreement, the Dublin Agreement, and also because of our agreement with EASO, the European Asylum Support Office, which is coordinating the member states in regard to their asylum policies. So Norway is very, very keen on doing the same as the EU member states. This as a starting point. I'd also like to point to the fact that this is an area where international law, international public law enters into the picture, of course with the Refugee Convention, which we also spoke about earlier in the morning, also with regional law, EU law, and national law. So there are 3 levels. And in addition to this, we are in a field which is very much politicized. So law and politics hand in hand. Now international law very much is like this, but I think it is an important thing for us to keep at the back of our heads when we are discussing today. I'd also like to say that there are dilemmas in regard to the question of law and the question of moral and political obligations. The two do not always meet, but they should all we should be aware of all of them. Now, as was pointed out by the State Secretary in the morning, European cooperation in the area of asylum and migration includes both border control and refugee protection. And this is an area where the EU has established a common European asylum system. It contains rules on who is regarded to be a refugee, which is based on the Geneva Convention, the Refugee Convention we have talked about, but also granting subsidiary protection. It contains rules on asylum procedures. It contains rules on reception conditions to asylum seekers, procedural rules. And it contains rules on granting temporary protection, which so far has never been used, as was pointed out. It takes the member states and the council to define whatever they see as a crisis or a major influx, to say this is an exceptional situation or a mass influx. It takes for them to admit this and then to allow refugees, asylum seekers to come onto European territory, but it has never been used. Now, human rights apply to all migrants, refugees and other migrants alike. Refugee law applies to refugees only, that is, persons who are fleeing because of fear of persecution for the reasons that have been stated in the Refugee Convention definition. Those who have well-founded fear of persecutions for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or for belonging to a particular social group. Europe has also established rules on control measures, the Schengen cooperation, alongside the common European asylum system. And as you know, Norway is part of the Schengen cooperation. Here we have rules on the application of visas, on punishing carrier sanctions for bringing irregular migrants to the territory. Here we have practical setups of liaison officers operating in transit countries to try and avoid people from coming to Europe. It's a whole set of possibilities of preventing people from seeking access. So this explains why people from Syria, fleeing Syria, refugees, do not just hop on a plane and fly to Europe. If they come to the counter, airplane counter, their papers will be checked. They might not have the necessary papers. Or the Schengen liaison officer might be there to say, sorry, no way you can fly. For the airport personnel, the airline personnel, they will be checking also. They are like immigration officers far away. They want to prevent their companies from being fined and having to return the people who are seen as irregular migrants, although they are refugees. What does it take to be a refugee? I mentioned the convention definition, but does it take for a state to claim that the person is a refugee, or is the refugee a refugee because he or she fulfills those criteria. According to international public law, the person is a refugee because he or she is at risk of persecution for the reasons mentioned, not because a state tells the person and states that the person is a refugee. And this is law. This is not just wishful thinking. But this is hardly ever mentioned. And I'm saying this and I'm dwelling on it a little bit because it's important when we also discuss what states' obligations are there to actually go out and rescue. States have a tendency of saying we are not obliged to help people flee, but we have to respect the principles of international law and allow refugees to seek asylum. But we don't have to go out and help them seek asylum. And this is an understanding by states which I think should maybe be challenged. It is questionable. Because if you follow my logic of saying who is a refugee, which the UNHCR is also saying, it is a person who is in fear of persecution for those stated reasons, not because the government has said he or she is a refugee. It makes it, in my mind, more of towards a legal obligation as well as a moral obligation to search and rescue, when you take this as a starting point. I'm not sure that all governments would agree with me, because this is not how things are at the moment. According to the law of the sea, there is an obligation to do search and rescue when the persons are found, when you are there, when the vessel sees them. Whether a Frontex vessel or a coastal guard vessel or a commercial vessel. This is for sure. But is there an obligation for state-run vessels in the Operation Triton, and with our ship, the Norwegian ship, now being sent to assist in the Mediterranean? Is there also an obligation beyond moral and political for them to go closer to the African coast to save lives? I put a question mark, but I want to raise it with you. We can perhaps bring it forward during the discussion as well. Now, the rights that belong to refugees seeking asylum is, as I said, to seek asylum. So countries will define obligations from the moment a refugee is standing at the doorstep, from the moment the person is at the border. This means that a person has to be allowed in so as not to violate the cornerstone, I would say, of international refugee law, the non-refoulement principle. You are not allowed to return a person to persecution from the territory, but you are also not allowed not to give access to the territory when the person is at the door. This is recognized by all states as a fundamental principle. And then, if the person is a refugee, all the rights contained in the Refugee Convention should be applied. Then the person has the right to the social rights contained therein and the protection which should be accorded to the person. Now, I agree totally with what Paul was saying about questioning whether this is a crisis when you compare to the situations elsewhere in the world. And we define here in Europe, we define this as a particular crisis. Now, Europe has the competency, Europe has the means and the possibilities and the obligation to give access to those who are at the door, to give them access, to assess their cases, to see whether or not Europe wishes to accord asylum or temporary protection for that matter, and also to assess if there are persons who are not in need of protection who can be returned in safety and dignity. All of this is possible. I forgot I had the manuscript. I got carried away. I was mentioning the deterring measures, such as the visa cooperation, such as the carrier sanctions cooperation, such as the liaison officers cooperation. But let us say the person reaches the European territory. Then a new deterring measure begins, which is what we also touched on in the morning a little bit, the Dublin Cooperation, which are procedural rights, meaning European states, including non-EU member states such as Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, have agreed on rules which decide which country should be responsible to carry out an asylum request. And as we also said in the morning, very often the case is the first country of entry which gets the responsibility. But there are other criteria. It could be the place, the country where there are relatives. It could be the country which has issued a residence permit. It could be the country which has issued a visa. What it means is it's the country which is the closest to carry responsibility for having let a person onto European territory. That's the clue. That's the thought behind it. Another thought behind it, which is important also, is that it shouldn't matter which country examines the case. Because in principle, because of the common European asylum system, we all do the same. Which is, of course, not true. We do not do all the same. The ambition is that it should be the same, but reality is different. This has been recognized by the EU institutions, and therefore we got a new set of provisions, new set of rules, new set of directives, which are, some haven't, the new ones haven't entered into force yet, they will this summer. But the Dublin regulation is definitely running, as you very well know. Took over from Dublin II and from the Dublin Convention as the first instrument on this. And countries love it somehow. The Dublin regulation will be assessed in autumn to see how it works. I mention this just to show that, again, for the asylum applicant, for the refugee, a new problem starts once European territory is reached, because then the person comes to, maybe travels through different countries. Of course, it's a hassle for countries to have to deal with the same person. Now, especially if some countries don't register, you know, as they are supposed to do according to the Eurodac regulation, which is there in place to make Dublin work. Now, we know very well that some countries tend to close their eyes to this, and people move onwards, northwards, for example. No country did Norway, for instance, return so many asylum applicants back to as Italy last year. So it's a popular instrument in Norway as well. Now, as this happens, it also means for the person concerned that he or she does not get the case examined for a long time. It can take 18 months or more before the person is actually back in the country, which is then responsible to carry out the examination. And the new waiting period begins. So it's a big hassle, and most people would try to avoid to enter into the queue of the Dublin system. I'd love to talk more about the Dublin system and why it works or doesn't work, but we will leave that for another time. Now, the EU has decided to do its utmost to fight smugglers, as we have been discussing already. And on the 18th of May, the Council approved that it would conduct a military crisis management operation to disrupt the business middle of human smuggling and trafficking networks in the southern central Mediterranean. So my question then is, how will refugees be protected during this endeavor? This is still very unclear. Will they be stuck in Libya? So far, we heard about solutions that have been proposed in the Commission's agenda. We can read the 10-point plan from the ministers. It's all quite vague, quite blurred, nothing very, very specific. But Europe does have rules, and as I said, competency and capacity. So what needs to be done, to be concrete, in my mind, is to establish legal channels when the smugglers are stopped, or fought. I think European states should consider making use of the temporary protection scheme in order to protect more people and more quickly. I think that member states should accept a much bigger quota than what is proposed with 20,000 for 2015. Among all the EU member states, I think it's rather shockingly low, this number, as others have always commented. Others have also commented. I think initiatives should be taken for humanitarian visas to be issued. I think an internal reallocation system within the EU should be established. I think we should stop making use of the Dublin system towards the southern states who are now carrying most of the burden of people who enter. And there is no excuse saying, yes, but they move on. The fact is, it's in the south that things are happening at the moment. I think that assistance should be made in cooperation between the European states to create a common examination of the cases, to provide adequate reception conditions, and to cooperate in the return of those who are not in need of protection. And I also would like to say that of all solutions that are chosen and the discussion and debate that we hear here in this country, for example, that we should help and assist people in the neighborhood or in their own country, yes, definitely we should do so. But there is no contradiction between assisting in the neighboring country and in the home country those who are internally displaced, or in the neighboring country who have, for instance, Lebanon, as was mentioned, 1/4 of the persons on the Lebanese territory is Syrian. Yes, we should assist. But we must also cater to those who are traveling on their own, who are asylum applicants. And in cooperation with UNHCR, we have to extend our quotas, and that goes for all of us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vigdis. I leave the floor to Maria Gabrielsen-Huber from Prio.
Thank you very much, Rocco. I will put up my... Thank you very much for all these great presentations until now. As we have seen from the morning session, we have taken a closer look at the different drivers and dynamics of migration, who the migrants and the refugees are. We've also seen different perspectives now on what the EU and what Europe does and what it could do more of. I will try and zero in on what the EU does in terms of border surveillance and border control in the Mediterranean. So what happens at the very doorstep of Europe, and what are the dilemmas raised in terms of border surveillance and border control, what can be done, and what, also importantly, what cannot be done in terms of border surveillance. Eurosur, the EU border surveillance system, after several years of preparation, was launched at the end of 2013. So just a few months after the big shipwreckings outside of Lampedusa, that sort of triggered more of the recent awareness around the need to respond more forcefully. But Eurosur was prepared for several years ahead, since 2008. And in the final Eurosur regulation, it states that it has the purpose of detecting, preventing, and combating illegal immigration and cross-border crime, and contributing to ensuring the protection and saving the lives of migrants. What I want to start to focus on is the dilemma in terms of what can actually be done in terms of combating so-called illegal immigration at sea, given the responsibility to search and rescue at sea, and given the principle of non-refoulement that we have just heard more details about. The central paradox, it's a way of summing up things that have already been said in different ways throughout the morning session and this afternoon already. Migrants at sea are seen as illegal
as soon as they are on the boat at sea. At best, they are referred to as irregular. In EU policy documents, they were more often referred to as illegal in 2008 when the EU started to prepare the Eurosur document. And then there was an awareness, okay, well, they can't really call them all illegal, so we're shifting to irregular. But basically, it's a lot of the same meaning behind. But it's not, we should remember, it's not illegal to go on board a boat in North Africa. Anyone has the right to leave his or her country. It's stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, then what we are discussing now is that any sovereign state can decide on who has the permission to enter or not. The challenge here is that this is something that the EU tries to do at the very external border of the EU at sea. Then we also know that for asylum seekers, an illegal entry, meaning an unauthorized entry into a country, should not in any way prevent them from receiving protection and asylum if they are entitled to it. So when their cases are examined, if they came into that country without proper authorization, that should not in any way hamper their access to asylum. In practice, as we have already seen as well, those who flee and who may be entitled to international protection today sort of find themselves with no other option than this so-called illegal way of entry to Europe. I would also argue that this is where this specific market for so-called smugglers and facilitators appears, but also where the insecurities along the way appears, because migrants are forced to run incredibly high risks along the way when they migrate. The legal obligations at sea, they have already been touched upon, but what it means in terms of border surveillance is, I will be brief, we will touch upon this, but the search and rescue obligation means that for any vessel, there's an obligation to bring rescue to another vessel in distress at sea. A full field search and rescue operation is not only taking them on board your vessel, so rescuing them from the immediate life-threatening situation, but it's also bringing them back to a safe harbor. But what is a safe harbor? Is that the nearest geographical harbor? Not necessarily. That's not what's stated in the SOLAS and SAR conventions. It's the only thing that is stated is a safe harbor. So it could be the next port of destination of this vessel, or it can be, as we touched upon, an agreement with other vessels bringing them to another safe harbor. But with the non-refoulement principle, this sort of shifts what a safe harbor could be. It's not only, it's no longer only bringing in, for example, migrants or seeking to rescue migrants closer to the North African coast would not justify completing a search and rescue operation by bringing the rescued back to North Africa if that compromises the non-refoulement principle of bringing or preventing people from applying for asylum or bringing them back to a place where they fear for their own security. There was a case of a pushback operation a few years back under the framework of the cooperation agreement between Italy and Libya under the Gaddafi regime, where a boat of migrants were pushed back to Libya. But these migrants, and they were not told that they were being brought back to Libya. They thought all the way that they were being brought to Italy, and they were brought back to Libya and handed over to the Libyan authorities and put into detention centers. These migrants and refugees afterwards, mainly from Eritrean and Somali origins, took this case to the European Court of Human Rights, which came to a judgment in early 2012, which is the case of Hirsi and others versus Italy. The judgment of this case ruled that this was a case of collective expulsion, so not assessing the individual cases, and of a breach of the non-refoulement principle. Because even if they were stopped outside of the Italian borders, it was ruled that they were under Italian jurisdiction because they were being brought on board an Italian border patrol vessel. So I think that after this ruling, it has become de facto more difficult to do what was referred to as pushback operations, meaning stopping vessels outside the European border and bringing them back to the North African coast. Some of the limits of border surveillance at sea is what I would like to say a few more words about now, because a lot of resources are put into improving the EU's border surveillance capacities. We see that also now with the main EU response being to reinforce the Frontex operation Triton, to being able to do better border control outside Italy, outside Greece, etc. But and it's often being presented as it is often being repeated that Triton and Frontex is not a search and rescue agency, it's a border control agency. But detection through surveillance systems, and again, as I said, there's a lot of resources being invested into highly sophisticated surveillance systems, not only coastal radars or patrol boats. There are being investigations into the possible uses of drones for improved border surveillance. But no matter how sophisticated the surveillance system, it cannot sort migrants between the legitimate travelers and the illegitimate ones. That's not a process that can be done through a technological surveillance at sea. This has to be processed by competent authorities on land in a way that is able to assess the individual cases. As I just mentioned, it seems that following the Hirsi and others versus Italy, the case of Hirsi and others versus Italy judgment, that detection now more rarely, it's more difficult to detect and then push back. Migrants are more often detected and it becomes a de facto search and rescue operation, and they are then being brought to a European harbor. Because if we would think that what could the European border guards seeking to execute their border control mandates at sea, what could they do? If they see a boat of migrants that they suspect are unauthorized migrants, well, they can't intercept them and stop and leave them there. That would be putting their lives to risk in the current situation. They can't ask them to go back either. That would be a possible breach of the non-refoulement principle. So in practice, it becomes search and rescue operations where the migrants are brought to Europe. That is also, in practice, what happened with the Mare Nostrum operation last year, which came out of a realization that there was a massively increased need for search and rescue. But even though it was carried out outside the Italian borders, they were brought back to Italian harbors afterwards. In this shift that I'm trying to address here, where for a long time there were attempts to push the European border out, sort of extra territorialization of the border control, pushing it out outside of the maritime borders into third countries, etc. With the Mare Nostrum operation, there was a sort of almost an exception. It was being brought closer to Europe again. I would now, as a conclusion, argue that the new or the more recent security focus on the so-called migrant smugglers is a way again of moving this border control outside the European borders again. It becomes a new reason for increasing border surveillance capacities. One of the points in this 10-point plan of the EU stated that we should identify, detect in order to destroy the migrant smugglers' boats, which calls for more surveillance to be able to detect these migrant boats. 2 days ago, as Vigdis just mentioned as well, EU leaders agreed to launch a military operation to sink the smugglers' boats. This seems to be a new way of claiming control over the situation after Mare Nostrum widely became seen as constituting a pull factor of migration to Europe. As was mentioned this morning as well, the first time this argument was put forward as from the British government that Mare Nostrum basically constituted a pull factor of migration, it was seen as something almost horrific. It was quite unique. But we see that with this year's debates, it's an impression that has installed itself, that there is a fear to rescue almost, because there's a fear to encourage more migration across the sea. There's a series of concerns raised with this new decision to launch a military operation, which we can, of course, discuss further in the discussion session as well. First, what kind of means will be deployed to execute the operation? What kind of armed intervention will we see? Will it be carried out without Libya's approval? Libya has stated its concerns, or the government in Tripoli at least has stated its concerns with this decision. What will be the consequences of doing something in Libyan territorial waters without Libya's approval? And will we see migrants finding themselves in the line of fire? So as a conclusion, I see this as I said, a new way of moving the EU border further out, rather than again seriously discussing the strengthening of the European infrastructure for both search and rescue, but also for receiving and processing the asylum claims. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. I will propose to move directly to the coffee break and come back for the question and answer and the discussion.